I'm very glad to be joined today by Kidus Girma, who is with Hunger Strike for Climate Justice. He is just at the end of a climate strike that had been going on for how long, Kidus?
14 days.
14 days. All right. So I'm glad to hear that you've eaten, but can you tell our audience a little bit more about why you were on strike and why the strike ended?
Yes. Me and my friends were on a 14-day hunger strike demanding climate justice from the Biden administration and Congress. We were demanding at least 50% emission cuts by 2030. We were demanding the agenda that the president had ran on and promised the American people, the agenda that a supermajority of Americans have supported, whether we're talking about climate or care or jobs or all the necessary things that we need to live in a just society. And we ended our hunger strike on the 14th day to refuel our bodies and get right back into the fight, focusing on Manchin. So 2 days after the hunger strike ended, we held an action outside of Senator Manchin's yacht and also followed him to his Maserati and confronted him about why he was selling the young people of West Virginia, the young people of this country, and the young people of this world to oil and coal billionaires. And on that day, we got Maserati to go trending.
Yeah, so that is the footage that, of course, triggered my attention, piqued my interest, and triggered me to go ahead and invite you on the program. I'm curious what you make of the response to that protest, because oftentimes when we see a protest that, let's say, block a bridge or traffic or something like that, there's a lot of hand-wringing about how, you're alienating the public. If you interrupt people's commutes to work, they're going to turn against your cause, even if they could have been sympathetic. In this instance, you were blocking one senator's Maserati, but I still saw some of those kinds of reactions. Overall, what kind of feedback did you guys get?
I think the broad majority of the reaction we got was very, very positive. Interestingly, on Reddit, a lot of folks were actually very down with our direct action. I don't know if you follow responses to direct actions on Reddit, but usually it's like advice rather than support. And in this case, we got a lot of support. And I think it was because of what the action highlighted, right? So the action highlighted wealth inequality. It highlighted a disparity between what Manchin says about who he is as a folksy West Virginian guy fighting for the everyday people, and also the Italian-made car that he actually drives in to get from his yacht to the halls of Congress. And I think also to answer your question about the action and the perception of the action, our goal, or my goal when I think of nonviolent direct action, is to highlight a moral crisis. And so it's not so much what does a random subtweet say about you shouldn't have done that, or I would have stood on the northwest corner of that yacht. It's rather to highlight the moral crisis. So we can look back about sit-ins during the civil rights era, and the majority of white people in America were we did not like that. You should not have done that. And then simultaneously, we see an increase in support for civil rights legislation.
There seems to be a real allergy these days to folks believing that they could influence public opinion in a positive direction. There is an emphasis on polls, seemingly only when the poll shows that something has minority support. There is no interest in polls when they show, to your point, that overwhelming majorities of Americans want a Green New Deal, want climate reform, et cetera, want at very minimum what Joe Biden actually ran on. But there's a lot of emphasis on polls that show minority report for certain other kinds of progressive issues without any belief that actions like yours could try to move the needle toward the other direction. Has there been any specific response on the ground in West Virginia? I'm curious.
I think there's been a range of responses. I think there's the narrative that Manchin tells about himself. And I think there's the actual economic reality of where West Virginia ranks as far as access to healthcare, education, and all these sort of things that would greatly improve if Manchin would just either get out of the way and support the bill or start fighting for his constituents. And so I think there's a conversation here about West Virginia, and there's a conversation here about the country. And I think there's also just a much larger conversation about humanity and what we need from the US government to put us in the right footing to actually combat climate injustice. And so there's who Manchin is in West Virginia, but I think there's just a much larger conversation about who we are as people and what we're willing to fight for and what do we actually need to live in a just world.
So your hunger strike outside of the White House caught the attention of the press secretary, Jen Psaki, who was asked a question about it at a recent press conference. And she said that while she admired what you guys were doing, she wasn't sure what your specific demands were. What were your specific demands, and do you feel like they've been met now that the strike has ended?
Our specific demands were at least 50% cuts in emissions by 2030. They have yet to be met. We also know that the White House was aware of them from previous conversations with John Kerry and Gina McCarthy and Ali Zaidi. Is that how you pronounce it? And so they were aware. We have been in contact with them. I personally emailed them. They were aware of it. And also I think we're in this moment where we need the president of the United States to actually come out as the president of the United States, where he's been almost doing that and doing a lot of shadow deals and backroom conversations and late night phone calls, and not so much morally leading in this moment of naming and shaming why the American people can't get Biden's agenda. And I think that would be naming corporatist Democrats who are bought out and owned by oil and gas billionaires and saying Manchin, Gottheimer, and other folks are obstructionists. That is their goal, and they're keeping us from things like paid leave, expanding Medicare, climate policies that are deeply important to everyone.
Do you see that happening? I mean, I'm just curious what your level of kind of optimism/pessimism is. It can get a little dark in the climate space, I know. But I mean, what is your kind of structural analysis of why it is that someone like Joe Biden is dragging his feet on his own campaign promises, why he already set his campaign promises so below what I would argue, and you would probably agree, the country and the world needs in this moment? Why are we kicking and screaming in a moment when we should be leading? And do you think, does that analysis play into your strategic assessments of what to do in terms of protesting to advance your interests? Is this really a bid to convince Biden, or is it a bid to embarrass Biden and prevent the administration from being able to pretend it's doing its best, and that, the problem is just one senator from West Virginia?
The goal for me is always to target the public as a whole and to invite everyone into the conversation to make Biden choose, right? To make a choice, because so far he hasn't made a choice. He's been kind of every which way, depending on who you're following on Twitter. He'll be oh, I'm pushing for Biff right now, but BBB if I can get it, sort of thing. And our goal is to invite as much of the public into the conversation, so Biden and Manchin have to decide. And my goal isn't actually to instrumentally move them. I'm not trying, when I'm on a hunger strike for 14 days, I'm not trying to pull on Biden's heartstrings so that he recognizes the value of me and my friends. My goal is to change the political conditions as a whole so that Biden has to choose me and us, which is a really, really big goal. And I think if you're a pessimist, you might say oh, that's never going to happen. You're never going to win that battle. But I'm a deeply set in my bones optimist. And my argument would be based in what is politically possible changes all the time. Just every 2 to 3 years, something that was deeply impossible politically has shifted. And I think the classic example I come back to is Occupy, right? As a movement is instrumentally often seen in the language of failure, but symbolically shifted class conversations in the country drastically. And I also think of the last 2 to 3 years in the context of the pandemic, the idea that the US government would cut checks and hand them directly to the people would have been completely impossible in 2018. But the conditions changed so drastically that happened round after round after round. And so I think we're in this moment again of can we change what is politically possible? And I think that's what made trending Maserati Manchin really important, right? Because it changed, in some sense, how Manchin is perceived in a way that he does not like to be perceived, right? He has a very clear, I'm folksy, everyone hates me, it's really hard to be me, someone pay attention to me, I'm the last living bipartisan person in this party, when instead he is a bought out coal millionaire. And that's the framing of this is a man who makes money off of the suffering of people. And that's the reframing we need so that Manchin feels cornered.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And strangely enough, it seems like former President Barack Obama agrees in some respects. I don't know if you caught his remarks at COP26 in Glasgow recently, which he said it's young people protesting that are ultimately going to move the needle. A lot of folks had a skeptical reaction to that, given that he was the president of the United States and had plenty of power to move the needle himself. But as a young person who's an activist, what did you make of that statement?
I don't think politicians create political change. I think politicians follow the political wind, and people and movements and organized folks in particular create that wind. And so I think history books are written in a very clear sense of and then Kennedy did this, and then LBJ did this, instead of what were the political conditions and who shifted those political conditions? And so I think LBJ is not someone that I would identify as a civil rights icon, but you can open a history book and be like, well, he passed the 1964 Act. And that's not, yeah, he passed it, but like the conditions changed because the civil rights era changed those conditions. And so I think my accurate take of it would be not who will Biden be in the history books 20 years from now, but who will we make Biden in those books 20 years from now? And also, how do we tell history accurately that invites everyone as not spectators, but like actual participants in it all? Because we are, right? And like the moments where people and low-income people and people of color and other marginalized folks are the most dangerous is when they're united and working in organized communities.
So to that end, what would you say to listeners who want to get involved in climate justice movements? What do you think are the best pressure points for people to commit to?
I think one, there's a lot of different climate orgs. And I would ask folks to join an org instead of starting their own org unless they see like a really big hole. And so I'm a Sunriser. I'm a hub coordinator in the Dallas hub. And so I would plug in Dallas and Sunrise Movement, but I would also think of like Fridays for Futures and a lot of like indigenous groups that do a lot of local work that don't get attention. And so I guess my first ask would be like, how do you support low-income people of color doing climate organizing and plug in there and support them there? And that can be monetarily, your time, mostly your time, and really plugging into an organizing community. And it doesn't just have to be climate. Like I love housing organizing. And so my only real ask is like, join us in many big and small ways and become an active supporter and organizer. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's really heartening to hear, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing. I'll drop whatever links you send me after this in the show notes for this so people can get involved directly if they're interested. And I want to give you an opportunity to say anything else that you might want to before we wrap today.
Yeah, I think I would invite a lot of folks into organizing in this very moment, right? The battle's not over. The bill has not passed. This thing could easily stretch into December or longer, and we need to do a lot of really critical organizing. And so the thing that I would plug is our Twitter, which will probably change in the next couple of days, but we do what we can. Hunger Strike with a 1 in the place of the I, and so you can follow us there. And you could follow me personally, but I'm not much of a Twitter person, so that might be a disappointing follow, but it's KIDUS_GIRMA, but no feelings hurt.
Well, thank you so much for joining today. And thank you for a little dose of climate optimism. It's much needed.
No problem. Thank you.
Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.